It should have been the beginning of something. Dinner lasted almost 3 hours because neither of them wanted it to end. They laughed. They stayed long after the plates had been cleared. At one point, he started talking about things he admitted he'd never told anyone before. And when he walked her to the door, he looked at her like she was the only person in the world. She went to bed thinking, this is it. Something's changed. It finally felt real. And then, nothing. The texts got shorter, the replies started taking longer, and within a week, it felt like she was talking to someone who'd already disappeared. So she asked herself the same question almost everyone asks when this happens. What did I do wrong? But she didn't do anything wrong, and that's the part that changes everything. Because what happened to her has a name, it has a cause. And once you understand the pattern behind it, you'll never look at someone's silence the same way again. What she ran into wasn't cruelty. It wasn't someone playing games. And it wasn't someone suddenly losing interest overnight. What she ran into was an avoidant attachment system doing exactly what it has learned to do. Over the next few minutes, we're going to unpack what's actually happening inside someone who pulls away the moment a relationship starts feeling real. Where that wiring comes from, the exact moment it gets triggered, and the one thing almost everyone gets wrong when they love someone like this. Because getting that part wrong usually makes the whole situation worse. So let's get into it. Let's start with what's happening beneath the surface, because it's almost the opposite of what it looks like. From the outside, someone pulling away looks cold. It looks like they stopped caring, like they lost interest. But inside, something very different is happening. An avoidant nervous system has one automatic response when emotional closeness becomes too intense. Psychologists call it deactivation. And it works pretty much the way it sounds. When emotional intimacy rises beyond what their nervous system can comfortably handle, they don't naturally lean in. Their system starts shutting things down, almost like it quietly pulls the plug on feelings that suddenly feel overwhelming. Just think about that for a second. The closer they start feeling to you, the louder an internal alarm begins to sound. Not because they suddenly think you're dangerous, it's the closeness itself that feels dangerous. To their nervous system, those two things become almost impossible to separate. So that incredible date, the deep conversation, the moment they finally opened up, that wasn't simply the high point before everything fell apart. For an avoidant system, that moment became the trigger. They didn't pull away despite how good it felt. They pulled away because it felt that good. Sit with that for a moment, because it completely flips the story most people tell themselves. But then another question comes up. Why would anyone's brain be wired to run from the very thing most people spend their lives searching for? The answer goes back much further than any relationship they've ever had. Most attachment styles begin forming when we're very young, long before we understand dating, long before we know what love is. Our brain is quietly trying to answer one simple question. When I need comfort, what happens? For someone who develops a secure attachment, the answer is fairly consistent. They reached out, someone came, they were comforted. Over time, their nervous system learns something incredibly important. People are safe. Closeness is safe. But not every child learns that lesson. Some children reach for comfort and no one comes. Or the response is unpredictable. Maybe the caregiver is physically there, but emotionally unavailable. Loving one day, distant the next. Maybe every time the child becomes too needy, they get pushed away. Little by little, the child's brain starts reaching a different conclusion. Depending on people hurts. Needing people gets me disappointed. The safest way to live is not to need anyone at all. Now, here's the part people often misunderstand. That child isn't weak. They're incredibly adaptable. In fact, they're doing something remarkable. They learn to comfort themselves. They stop asking for reassurance. They become independent much earlier than they should have to. And for that stage of life, it works. It protects them. But then life moves on. That same child grows into an adult, only the nervous system never got the memo that life has changed. So the survival strategy that protected them at 4 years old walks straight into their relationships at 34. The independence that once kept them emotionally safe now quietly stands between them and the people they care about most. That's why understanding this matters so much. Because when an avoidant partner suddenly pulls away, you're usually not watching them make a decision about your worth. You're watching an old survival strategy take over, one that was written years, sometimes decades, before you ever entered their life. It isn't really about you. It never was. And actually, this doesn't just apply to them. It applies to you too. Because every one of us has an attachment pattern. Maybe your instinct is to move towards people. Maybe it's to move away. Maybe you find yourself doing both, depending on the relationship. Whatever your pattern is, it's quietly shaping the way you connect with people, often without you even realizing it. That's exactly why I created the attachment map. It's a free guide that helps you identify your own attachment style, understand the patterns behind it, and see how those patterns show up in your relationships. If you've never explored your attachment style before, it's honestly the best place to start. You'll find it linked first in the description. So now we know what's happening, and we know where it comes from. But here's the question that actually matters when you're living through it. When does an avoidant person suddenly decide to pull away? Because despite how it feels, it's rarely random. There are certain moments that almost act like switches. And once you know what they are, you start seeing the pattern everywhere. The first one is emotional intensity. We've already touched on this. It's the deep conversation, the vulnerable confession, the night where both of you leave thinking, that felt different. For most people, moments like that create connection. For an avoidant nervous system, they can create alarm. The more emotionally exposed they feel, the louder that internal warning becomes. The second one is a little different. It's expectation. Not necessarily commitment itself, the expectation of commitment. The moment the relationship starts pointing towards the future, maybe someone brings up becoming exclusive, meeting each other's families, moving in together, talking about long-term plans. To most people, those conversations feel exciting. But to an avoidant nervous system, they can feel like a door quietly closing. Not because they don't care, but because their brain starts interpreting closeness as the loss of freedom. The independence they've built their identity around suddenly feels like it's under threat. And then there's the third one. This is the one that catches a lot of people off guard. It's your distress. Imagine this. They've started pulling away. You notice. You become anxious. You ask what's wrong. You want reassurance. Maybe you send another message, then another. You just want clarity. You want things to go back to how they were. Honestly, it's one of the most natural reactions in the world. But here's where the cycle begins. An avoidant nervous system doesn't usually experience that pursuit as love. It experiences it as pressure. And pressure is exactly what activates the retreat. So the more anxious one person becomes, the more the other person withdraws, which makes the first person even more anxious, which creates even more distance. It's a painful loop. And it's one of the biggest reasons anxious and avoidant partners often find themselves stuck in the exact same argument over and over again. The really frustrating part? The thing you instinctively want to do. Chase harder, ask more questions, fix it immediately. That's often the very thing that pushes them even further away. So that raises the obvious question. If chasing makes the situation worse, what actually helps? Hold on to that for a second. Because before we answer it, there's one misunderstanding we need to clear up first. And once you see it, almost everything else starts making sense. Here's the belief most people carry. When someone pulls away, we assume they didn't care enough, that we weren't important enough, that their feelings simply faded. But quite often, it's the opposite. Sometimes they pull away because they feel too much. Think back to everything we've talked about. their nervous system isn't reacting to a lack of emotion. It's reacting to emotional intensity. So the stronger the feelings become, the louder that old survival alarm starts ringing, and the stronger the urge to create distance. That's why pulling away isn't always evidence that you meant very little. Sometimes it's evidence that the relationship began touching parts of them they never learned how to manage safely. That's the misunderstanding almost everyone makes. We look at distance and think they didn't care enough. But for an avoidant nervous system, distance is often what too much looks like. Now, that doesn't excuse the behavior. It doesn't make the silence okay, and it certainly doesn't make you responsible for regulating someone else's nervous system. But it does explain something that probably never made sense before. It explains why someone could seem deeply connected one moment and emotionally unavailable the next. Not because your value changed overnight, but because an old survival strategy quietly took over. And once you understand that, you stop seeing every silence as proof that you weren't enough. You start seeing it for what it usually is, a frightened nervous system doing the only thing it ever learned to do. If understanding these patterns has helped make sense of something you've been carrying around for a long time, that's exactly why this channel exists. Every week, we break down the psychology behind the moments that confuse us most. Why people disappear, why we overthink, why relationships get stuck in the same painful cycles, and more importantly, what we can actually do about them. So if that's the kind of understanding you're looking for, subscribe. I'd love to have you here. Now let's go back to the woman from the beginning, the one staring at her phone, reading the silence, wondering what she'd done wrong. Now you know something she didn't. She didn't ruin the relationship. She didn't say the wrong thing. She didn't accidentally push away someone who cared. She walked into a nervous system that had learned a long time ago that closeness could feel unsafe. And that changes the story completely. So what should she do? Not chase, not punish, not disappear herself. If there's one thing I hope you remember after this video, it's this. Stay steady. Give them room, but don't disappear. That doesn't mean accepting unhealthy behavior, and it doesn't mean waiting forever for someone who isn't willing to grow. It simply means refusing to let fear decide your next move. Because here's what happens. The moment you start chasing, their nervous system feels more pressure. The moment you slam the door shut, their fear of closeness is reinforced. But calm consistency, that's different. Sometimes the safest thing you can offer is your steadiness, because that's one of the few signals an avoidant nervous system can actually hear. It quietly says, closeness doesn't have to feel dangerous. Now, that doesn't mean you can heal them. You can't. That work belongs to them. Real change usually takes awareness, intentional effort, and often the support of therapy or deep personal work. But you can stop becoming part of the cycle. You can stop adding more pressure and instead become someone who responds rather than reacts. Sometimes that's the difference that changes everything. So let's go back to that question one last time. What did I do wrong? Maybe nothing. Maybe the silence was never evidence that you weren't enough. Maybe it was evidence that someone else's nervous system never learned what safety felt like. And that's a very different story. The beautiful thing about understanding psychology isn't that it excuses people's behavior. It doesn't. It's that it helps us stop carrying blame that was never ours to carry. Because once you stop asking, why wasn't I enough? You can start asking a much healthier question. What pattern am I looking at? And sometimes that single shift changes everything. Thank you so much for watching. If this helped you understand someone in your life, or maybe even understand yourself a little better, let me know in the comments. I read every one. And if you haven't already, download the attachment map using the first link in the description. It'll help you identify your own attachment style and the patterns that quietly shape your relationships. Until next time, take care of your mind, because once you understand how it works, you start seeing your whole life differently. One final thought before you go. If you've ever loved someone with an avoidant attachment style, you've probably noticed something else. The more they pulled away, the harder it became to stop thinking about them. Almost like the distance itself made you want them even more. That isn't a coincidence either. It's another attachment pattern entirely. And once you understand that one, a lot of relationships suddenly start making sense. That's exactly what we're unpacking in the next video. I'll see you there.